The first scream of the wind dragged Ethan Cole from his restless sleep, but it was the sound that followed, a frantic, ragged whinny, that sent him sitting bolt upright. For a moment, he thought it was a dream, the kind that yanked him back to a past he no longer wanted. But the noise came again, sharp and desperate, carrying through the thin walls of his old ranch house. He swung his legs over the bed, felt the cold wood under his feet, and moved toward the window. There, under the washed-out gray of dawn, a horse stood tethered to his fence. At first glance, it didn't seem real. She was swaying on her legs, her head low, her coat dull to the color of ashes, her ribs pressed against her skin like the slats of a barrel, and her mane hung in tangled ropes over her eyes. The rope binding her to the fence looked frayed and cruelly tight, cutting into the skin just above her knee. Ethan's hand found the latch on the door before his mind caught up with his body. The cold air slapped him awake as he stepped outside, boots crunching on frostbitten dirt. The mare startled at his approach, eyes rolling white, muscles tightening under her bony frame. Her nostrils flared, and she pulled back against the fence as if expecting a blow. Ethan slowed, keeping his voice low and even, the way he'd once spoken to frightened colts years ago. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you." He extended a hand, palm open, letting her smell him. That's when he saw the note. It was tied to her halter with a piece of weathered twine, the paper stained with something that looked like dirt but smelled faintly of copper. His fingers hesitated before untying it, as though opening it might change something he couldn't undo. The handwriting was hurried, the letters uneven and jagged. Asterisk, she's yours now. Don't let them find her. Asterisk. The words lodged in his chest. He glanced around the empty fields, scanning the dirt road beyond his property. Nothing moved. The wind pressed against him, whispering through the dry grass. Whoever had left her here had done it quietly, and not long ago. He studied the mare again. She was wild. That much was clear from the fire flickering beneath her exhaustion. Her eyes darted from him to the open spaces, calculating escape. She didn't belong to the tidy, docile world of ranch stock. She belonged to places where fences didn't exist. Yet here she was, tied to his land, too weak to fight. Ethan considered walking away. This wasn't his problem, not anymore. He'd spent years building a life that kept him away from other people's troubles, and especially from horses. He still carried the memory of the last one he trained, a stallion whose name he never spoke aloud, and the day everything went wrong. His brother had been there, trying to help, and the accident. No, he wouldn't think about that. But when the mare's legs buckled and she collapsed into the dirt, his decision was made for him. He was beside her in 2 strides, untying the rope and easing her head onto his lap. Her skin was hot under the cold air, her breathing shallow and ragged. He could walk away from a problem, but not from a dying creature looking at him with eyes that still held the will to live. He got her to her feet with slow, steady coaxing, guiding her toward the barn. Every step seemed to cost her, but she followed, her weight leaning against him more than once. Inside, he cleared a stall in quick, practiced motions, scattering fresh straw and filling the water bucket. She drank greedily, nearly choking in her rush. He found a blanket in the tack room, old but clean, and draped it over her narrow back. For a long time, he just stood there, watching her breathe. The note was still in his hand, crumpled from the sweat of his palm. Don't let them find her. Who were they? What kind of trouble had stumbled onto his land? His gut told him this wasn't about a lost pet or a stray. This was something darker. He'd seen the kind of men who looked at a horse and saw only money, and the lengths they would go to keep their hold on one. He told himself he'd decide what to do in the morning, but sleep never came. He sat at the kitchen table, coffee cooling in front of him, staring at the paper as though it might explain itself. Outside, the wind rose and fell, carrying with it the restless shifting of hooves from the barn. Near midnight, the sound of an engine drifted in from the road. Ethan froze. The headlights washed briefly over his front yard before cutting out. The silence that followed was heavier than the night air, pressing against the walls. His fingers curled into fists as he stood and moved toward the window. There was nothing out there, just the black shape of the fence and the faint glow from the barn. But he didn't go back to his chair. He stayed by the window, watching, until the coffee went cold and the frost began to creep across the glass. When dawn came again, the light fell on the mare in the stall, her head lifting when she saw him, ears twitching forward. She was still alive, and for reasons he didn't yet understand, she was still here. The note lay on the kitchen table. The words burned into his mind. Whatever had started with that rope on his fence wasn't over. It had only just begun. By the time the first sunbeam crept across the barn floor, the mare was already watching him. Her ears flicked at his every movement, sharp and alert despite the hollows along her sides. She didn't bolt when he stepped closer, but her body stayed tight, like a coiled spring. Ethan eased the stall door open, a flake of hay under his arm, speaking in the low tone that seemed to settle her. She sniffed the hay, then began to eat with slow, deliberate bites. "You're a fighter," he murmured, resting his arms on the stall's half-door. He had not meant to say it aloud, but the words hung there, as much for him as for her. He'd spent years without naming anything, no strays, no livestock he planned to sell, because names meant attachment, and attachment meant loss. But staring at the mare's dark, stormy eyes, he thought of the black sables his mother once kept in a box by her bed, little stones that caught the light even in shadow. "Sable," he said softly. Her ears twitched at the sound, as though she understood. That morning passed in quiet routine, the kind he'd avoided for too long. He hauled water, checked her rope burns, and found himself noticing how her breathing steadied when he lingered near. She wouldn't let him touch her flank, but she didn't shy away from his voice. Still, the note burned in the back of his mind. Don't let them find her. Whoever had left her hadn't been running from nothing. When the rumble of tires on gravel reached his ears that afternoon, Ethan stepped out into the yard. A pickup truck rolled to a stop at the edge of his drive, its engine idling. A man climbed out, mid-40s, lean, eyes hidden under the brim of a dust-stained hat. "Morning," the man called, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm looking for a horse. Young mare. Slipped away from my place couple nights back." Ethan's heartbeat slowed to something cold. He kept his stance easy, one thumb hooked in his belt. "Haven't seen one," he said, letting the lie settle between them. The man's gaze drifted past Ethan toward the barn. "If you do, you give me a call." He pulled a card from his pocket, but didn't step closer to hand it over. Instead, he tossed it into the dirt at Ethan's feet, turned on his heel, and climbed back into the truck. Gravel spat under the tires as he drove off, the cloud of dust trailing like a warning. Ethan waited until the sound faded before picking up the card. No business name, just a first name, Travis, and a phone number. He didn't like the feel of it. Men who had nothing to hide didn't throw their names in the dirt and leave like that. That evening, after checking on Sable, Ethan drove into town. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly in the cooling air as he parked his truck. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried onions wrapped around him like an old coat. Behind the counter, Martha Lane, retired veterinarian, widow, and one of the few people he still spoke to, looked up with mild surprise. "Haven't seen you in months," she said, pouring him a cup before he even asked. "I need you to take a look at something," he replied. "Brand mark on a mare." Her brows lifted, but she followed him outside after locking the door. When she saw Sable's flank under the barn light, she swore under her breath. "That's a BLM mark," she said, tracing the faint outline with her fingertips. "Mustang, but it's been burned over. Someone didn't want her traced." "Why?" "Because there's money in moving wild stock off public land and into private hands," she said grimly. "Not legally, of course. There's a ring operating out past the ridge. They'll brand over, sell him quiet, sometimes ship him out of state. And if she was worth something to them," her gaze lifted to meet his, "they'll come looking." Ethan felt the truth of it settle heavy in his gut. The note said not to let them find her. "Then don't," Martha said simply. "And be careful. They're not the kind who walk away empty-handed." Back at the ranch, the night pressed close around him. The barn felt warmer than the house, so he stayed there, leaning against the stall door as Sable chewed contentedly. He thought about his brother, about the day they'd worked side by side in a different barn before everything fell apart. He told himself then he was done training, done saving. But now he stood here, making silent promises to a horse that wasn't supposed to be his. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of care and quiet vigilance. Sable's strength began to return. Her coat took on a faint sheen, and her eyes lost the glassy film of exhaustion. She started meeting him at the stall door, her muzzle nudging at his sleeve for grain. Each small sign of trust hooked deeper into him than he wanted to admit. One night, the quiet broke. He woke to the low, uneasy rumble of Sable's whinny. When he reached the barn, she was pacing, muscles tense, ears pricked toward the distant road. Ethan stepped outside and caught the faint glint of headlights before they vanished. The sound of an engine carried on the wind, growing louder, then fading again. He didn't sleep after that. Every shadow seemed to move. Every crunch of gravel in the dark made his hand drift toward the old rifle by the door. He told himself it was just caution, but deep down he knew this wasn't going to end with the mare simply healing and him letting her go. Someone wanted her badly enough to brand her twice, to drop her on his fence with a warning, and to come sniffing around within a day. And whoever they were, they didn't seem the type to ask twice. The wind had turned sharp overnight, carrying with it the smell of distant rain. Ethan stood at the edge of his property, his boots sinking into the soft earth, where tire tracks carved fresh scars into the ground. He crouched, running his fingers over the impressions, broad, deep, made by a heavy truck. They hadn't been there yesterday. His eyes drifted toward the barn, where Sable's silhouette shifted against the dim light. She was watching him, her ears pricked, as if sensing the tension in his stance. Back inside, he pulled the crumpled note from the drawer where he'd been keeping it. The handwriting looked even more frantic under the morning light, the warning heavier with each reading. Don't let them find her. Whoever wrote it had known exactly what would happen if he failed. He tucked it back into the drawer and locked it, though he doubted a lock would stop the kind of men Martha had described. By midday, the sky had clouded over, and the sound of approaching engines rose from the road. This time, there were two vehicles, both pickups, both coated in dust. Ethan stepped onto the porch, his rifle resting loosely against his shoulder. The truck stopped just beyond his gate, and two men climbed out. He recognized one, the man from before Travis. The other was taller, built like a fence post, his jaw set hard. "We're looking for our horse," Travis called, as if reading from a script. "She got loose, and we tracked her this way." Ethan's voice stayed even. "I told you before, haven't seen one." The taller man stepped forward, boots crunching over gravel. "Don't lie to us, Cole. We know she's here. She's valuable stock, and she's not yours to keep." The use of his name twisted something in Ethan's chest. They'd done their homework. He kept his stance firm, the rifle angled just enough to be noticed. "If you think you've got a claim, bring the sheriff. Until then, you're trespassing." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Travis smiled, slow, humorless. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Think on it. We'll be back." They turned and left, the trucks disappearing into the dust. Ethan stood there until the road was empty, then went straight to the barn. Sable shifted uneasily as he entered, her hooves shuffling against the straw. He rested a hand on her neck, feeling the quickened beat beneath her skin. "They're not taking you," he said, more to himself than to her. That night, the memories came back in pieces, sharp and unwelcome, his brother's voice urging him to give the stallion more space. The flash of hooves, the scream that hadn't been his, the silence afterward. He had run from that life, from training, from the unsteady balance between trust and danger that working with horses demanded. Yet here he was again, standing between a horse and the threat that hunted her. In the morning, he drove into town, seeking out an old friend who owed him more than one favor. Jess Turner worked for the local paper, and she had a knack for digging into places she wasn't welcome. When Ethan told her about Sable, the note, and the men who'd come calling, she scribbled it all down without interrupting. "I've heard whispers," Jess said finally. "Wild horse roundups going wrong. Animals disappearing from federal corrals. The official reports say they're adopted out, but some never make it to the adopters. A few folks think there's a trafficking operation running through here. If your mare's branded over, she's evidence they don't want found. Then the note came from someone inside. Could be. Could be someone with a conscience who knew she wouldn't last long in their hands. Either way, you've got their property, and they'll assume you know too much. On the drive back, Ethan kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting the dust of pursuit to rise on the road behind him. The barn was the first thing he checked when he returned. Sable was standing in the stall, calm now, her dark eyes fixed on him as though she'd been waiting. For the next 2 days, the ranch was quiet. Too quiet. Ethan kept his rifle within reach, worked close to the barn, and never let Sable out of sight. He could feel the tension in her when the wind carried the faintest scent of exhaust or the distant growl of an engine. Trust between them was building, not from soft words alone, but from the shared understanding of danger. On the third night, he woke to a creak from the barn. It wasn't the shifting of wood in the wind. This was deliberate careful. He grabbed the rifle and slipped outside, keeping low along the shadow of the fence. The barn door was ajar, swinging gently. Inside, Sable was pressed into the far corner, her breathing rapid. There was no one else in sight, but the latch on her stall had been lifted. Ethan crossed the space in 3 long strides and shut it firmly, his eyes scanning the dark. Through the side window, he caught movement, a shadow pulling away into the night, quick and silent. He didn't give chase. Whoever it was had been close enough to take her if they wanted. The fact they hadn't meant they were testing his vigilance. That realization settled into his bones like frost. They weren't going to give up. The next morning, he called Martha. "It's getting worse," he told her. "I'm not surprised," she said. "But you can't fight this alone. You need the law involved before it turns into something you can't walk away from." Ethan hesitated. The sheriff and he had a history, one that would make cooperation difficult. But as he watched Sable that afternoon, her head lifting at every noise, he knew Martha was right. Whatever fear he had of stirring up the past was less than the risk of losing her. That night, he sat in the barn with her, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing. The storm finally broke outside, rain hammering the roof and sheets. He thought about the note again, about the unknown hand that had tied it to her halter. Maybe they'd chosen him because they knew he wouldn't turn her over, no matter the cost. And as the thunder rolled across the valley, he made a decision. The next time those trucks came down his road, he'd be ready. This time, not just to stand in their way, but to end it for good. The rain had barely stopped when Ethan heard the low growl of engines on the road. This time, there was no hesitation in him. He moved to the porch, rifle slung across his chest, and watched as 3 trucks rolled into view, their headlights cutting through the early dawn. The lead truck stopped at the gate, and Travis stepped out, flanked by 2 men he didn't recognize, both broad, both carrying the confidence of men who had never been told no. "You had your chance, Cole," Travis called, his voice carrying easily in the damp morning air. "We're taking her now." Ethan stepped down from the porch, boots sinking into the wet ground. "She's not yours," he said evenly, "and she's not going anywhere." One of the strangers laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You think that rifle's gonna change anything?" Ethan's grip tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "I think it's enough to make you think twice." He glanced past them toward the ridge. He knew Martha had called the sheriff after their last conversation. Whether he'd get here in time was another matter entirely. The taller man stepped forward, the wet gravel crunching under his boots. "Move aside." Ethan didn't move. "If you want her, you'll have to come through me." For a moment, the air felt charged, thick with the weight of the standoff. Then Travis gave a slight nod, and the 2 men moved toward the barn. Ethan's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the clarity of purpose that had settled over him. This wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what stood in front of him, an animal who had trusted him enough to stay. Before the men reached the barn door, a shrill, defiant sound split the air. Sable's scream was like lightning in the quiet. The door burst open, and she came thundering out, ears pinned, eyes wild. Her hooves struck the mud, sending clumps flying as she charged at the nearest man. He stumbled back, slipping on the wet ground, and fell hard, his rope tumbling from his hands. The second man swore and tried to circle her, but she wheeled sharply, cutting him off. Her movements were still raw from weeks of recovery, but the fire in her was unmistakable. She wasn't running to escape. She was running to defend. In the chaos, a canvas bag dropped from one of their trucks, spilling its contents into the mud. Papers scattered, some plastering themselves to the wet ground. Ethan's eyes caught the black print, transport logs, purchase records, lists of horses marked with brands and destinations. His pulse kicked higher. This was more than proof. This was their operation on paper. Travis saw it too. "Pick that up," he barked, but Ethan was already moving. He scooped the papers into his arm, mud and rain soaking into the pages. The taller man started toward him, but stopped short when Ethan lifted the rifle. "That's enough," Ethan said, his voice cutting clean through the din. The moment hung, tense and brittle. Then the wail of sirens rose from beyond the ridge, faint but growing. Travis's jaw tightened, his gaze darting toward the road. "You just made yourself a problem, Cole," he said coldly. "Already was," Ethan replied. The trucks roared to life, mud spinning under their tires as they tore away from the property. The men didn't look back. By the time the sheriff's cruiser skidded to a stop at the gate, Ethan had the papers stacked on the porch and Sable back in the barn. Her sides heaved, but her eyes were bright, ears flicking as he spoke to her. "You did good, girl," he murmured, running a hand along her damp neck. The sheriff, a stocky man with a lined face, stepped up with Martha close behind. "Martha told me you had trouble," he said, scanning the property. "I'm guessing this is it." Ethan handed him the bag and the mud-spattered documents. Names, brands, transport records, all theirs. The sheriff whistled low. "This is enough to bury them." He looked toward the barn. "She the one they were after?" Ethan nodded. "Not anymore." The next hours passed in a blur of statements, photographs, and handshakes that felt more like formalities. By the time the last vehicle left, the sun had climbed higher, burning away the remnants of the storm. Ethan stood in the quiet yard, feeling the weight of days of tension lift from his shoulders. Inside the barn, Sable shifted toward him as soon as he entered. She smelled faintly of rain and straw, and when he reached out, she pressed her muzzle into his chest. The gesture was simple, but it felt like a seal on something unspoken. Weeks later, the valley had settled back into its slow rhythm. The trafficking ring was making headlines, their arrest splashed across the front pages, thanks to the evidence Martha had insisted he turn over. Ethan rarely read the articles. He didn't need the details to know they wouldn't be coming back. Sable's coat gleamed now, rich and full, the hollows in her frame filled with muscle. She moved with the ease of an animal who had reclaimed her strength, her head high when they crossed the pasture together. Ethan hadn't ridden her yet. He wasn't sure he ever would, but they understood each other in ways that didn't need saddles or bridles. One crisp morning, he stood at the fence, watching her move in the open field. The sun caught in her mane, turning it to threads of copper. He thought of the day she had arrived, a shadow of herself, tied to his fence with a warning he hadn't yet understood. Now, she was something else entirely, free, not in the wild, but in a space she had chosen to stay. He didn't fool himself into thinking the past was gone. The loss of his brother, the years he'd spent hiding from anything that could be taken away, those things still lived in him. But the ache had shifted. Where there had once been only the fear of losing, there was now the proof of what could be saved. As Sable loped toward him, slowing to a trot before reaching the fence, Ethan reached out a hand. She stopped just close enough for her muzzle to brush his palm, her breath warm against his skin. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "saving you was the only way to save me." The wind moved through the grass, carrying away the last trace of that morning's chill. In the distance, the world kept going, but here, in the quiet between them, nothing needed to be fixed or fought. She was home, and so was he. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.